Think your school was bad? Try sitting on a cold stone floor writing with bird feathers while a monk screams Latin at you and hits you for sneezing. Welcome to medieval school. They say school builds character. Medieval schools built something else callous is. You didn't walk into class and take your seat. You walked into a freezing stone room, found a corner, not yet claimed by someone else's snot or fleas, and squatted like a medieval gargoyle. Chairs were for nobles. Cushions? You mean the pile of straw that hadn't been changed since St. Augustine was a toddler. It wasn't so much a classroom as it was a test of how long a child could pretend to be literate before their knees gave out. There were no colourful posters, no motivational slogans on the wall, and certainly no Wi-Fi. What you had instead were stone walls damp with regret, a crucifix staring down at you, like it knew you'd never make it to heaven, and the constant smell of old wool-wet feet and burned porridge. If you were lucky, the room had one window, usually high up, usually tiny and mostly covered with something that pretended to be glass, but looked more like a smeared jar lid. Light, barely. Warmth. Not unless your classmates spontaneously combusted. Students came in two varieties, those with parents rich enough to buy them into school, and those forced in by the church, hoping they'd become the next monk who could read Latin and suppress emotion. Either way, no one was having fun. Your classmates were just as miserable as you, except for the one kid who secretly enjoyed correcting everyone's Latin pronunciation. That kid would one day become an inquisitor. You could already tell. He smiled too much when others got whipped. The teacher didn't greet you. He didn't ask how your morning was. He didn't even care if you were alive as long as you didn't make noise while being dead. If he noticed you at all, it was probably because you blinked at the wrong time or breathed too enthusiastically near his worn-out manuscript. Most teachers were unpaid or underpaid monks who traded in kindness for a lifetime subscription to bitterness. His robes smelled of ink, stale beer, and crushed dreams, and that's on a good day. Instead of pencils, you had wax tablets if you could afford one. Most kids scratched letters into wood with bone or charcoal. One slip and your B turned into a blasphemy, erase as your sleeve, or spit if you had any left. The idea was to write slowly, legibly, and without emotion, because any attempt at creativity would be interpreted as possession by demons. Imagination was a sin. So was using the left hand. So was enjoying anything, apparently. Homework was a joke because there was no home, just labour. After school, you returned to your chores, your hungry siblings, and your straw mattress that felt like sleeping on an angry broom. If you didn't finish your lines of copied Latin prayers, you'd do them while stirring cabbage soup or dodging rodents the size of ambition, and you couldn't complain. Complaining was for the nobility, or for people who could afford a second pair of socks. In the winter it got so cold in the classroom that the ink froze, so you breathed on it, or cried into it. Some boys came back with purple fingers and the teacher didn't care. It'll build endurance, he'd say, while blowing on his own fingers and warming them near a candle he kept just for himself. The candle wasn't for light, it was for taunting you. It whispered, "You will never be this warm." Discipline was constant. Learning was optional. The day didn't start with a bell. It started with a prayer and a slap if you forgot the words, and sometimes even if you didn't. Latin verses were recited through chattering teeth. If you messed up the Pater Nosters, that wasn't just a mistake, it was a theological crisis. You weren't just dumb, you were heretically dumb. So next time you're late for class and sigh about the temperature being a bit chilly, picture this barefoot lice in your hair, hunger in your stomach, and Sister Agnes eyeing your ankles like they owed her a confession. Welcome to class. Please sit down if you can find a spot that doesn't smell like despair. They called it grammar school, but that's because psychological warfare for children didn't fit on the parish notice board. Grammar wasn't just a subject, it was a religion. A cruel, unforgiving Latin-based religion, where the only true sacrament was suffering. Forget spelling tests. These kids were drilled like Roman soldiers in tunics 2 sizes too small. One misdeclined noun, and suddenly you're public enemy number 1, your ears ringing with a monk's disappointed sigh and the sting of a wooden rod across your knuckles. Imagine being 7 years old and told your soul might suffer eternal damnation because you conjugated the verb amare incorrectly. I love you, lovey loves, except no one loved being there. Latin was drilled into their skulls with the subtlety of a jackhammer made of shame. It wasn't even about comprehension. No one cared if you understood what you were saying. You just had to memorize endless tables of verbs and chant them like some doomed choir of mini-theologians trying to avoid a divine pop quiz. Recitation wasn't encouraged, it was mandatory, loud and terrifying. Students stood and rattled off lines in a drone that sounded more exorcism than education. If your voice trembled, your hands did too because they were about to be slapped, and you couldn't fake it. Teachers were trained to detect even the smallest whiff of uncertainty. Hesitatum puella est in horto. That's a one-way ticket to corporal punishment land. Population your butt. The teachers weren't just strict, they were vindictive. The kind of men who stared into the abyss and decided to drag you into it with them. Most were monks who saw education as a battlefield and your mind as the enemy. They weren't interested in you becoming a better person. They were interested in obedience order and making sure the Lord's name wasn't mispronounced by your filthy little mouth. Their favourite phrase, repetite repeat, and again, until your soul gave up and your tongue bled Latin. You didn't learn by doing, you learned by suffering, by copying, by mumbling Latin aloud for hours while your back cramped and your stomach cried for the bread you didn't have. If modern schools used positive reinforcement, grammar school used psychological terrorism. One boy in every class cried silently by midday. Another pretended to faint just to escape the next round of declensions. And there was always that one brave idiot who tried to run. He never made it past the door. Even the textbooks were designed to break you. They weren't colourful or engaging, they were slabs of wood and parchment that smelled like damp leather and despair. You didn't get your own copy. One book per group if you were lucky. If not, you leaned over someone else's shoulder while they whispered the answers and prayed the teacher didn't catch either of you. Sharing knowledge was a sin, unless it was between saints or the teacher's favourite pet student. Let's talk about the bell. Oh, that cursed bell, it didn't ring for recess. It rang for more Latin. It rang to signal the return to misery. It rang to remind you that joy was for other people and probably pagans. If the sound of school bells makes you nostalgic, it's because they no longer mean prepare for pain. Back then it meant the beatings were about to resume, and so was the poetry. Yes, poetry. Because if you thought memorising Latin verbs was fun, wait till you got to chant obscure odes, in a language no one had spoken conversationally in centuries. O tempora, O mores, O the horror. You weren't allowed to question the curriculum. You weren't allowed to ask why. You were told that it had been this way since Augustine, and it would be this way long after you were buried behind the school, with the others who failed to translate the girl is in the garden without flinching. Here's a bonus. If you were extra special, your school was attached to a cathedral. That meant more priests, more pressure, and longer hours. Sunday still class, holy days even holier class. There was no break from your grammatical damnation, and when you finally learned enough to be promoted, congratulations. Your reward was more grammar, more obscure rules, more chanting until you sounded like a human error message in Latin. Now imagine trying to learn all of this with a head full of lice and a stomach empty of anything but disappointment. Because hygiene was optional, and food was a luxury. Most students were half sick half the time. Fever dreams blended into grammar drills. At some point you couldn't tell if the Latin you were mumbling was real or hallucinated. Either way, the teacher hit you. Just to be sure. Modern school gives stickers. Medieval school gave scars. Not metaphorical ones, actual visible bruises that spelled qui and qui across your backside. Kids didn't get grounded. They got grounded. Into the floor. for talking, for coughing, for blinking out of rhythm. There was no such thing as a safe space unless you counted the one corner of the room where rats bit quietly, and yet people romanticize it. They imagine Hogwarts with a touch of history. Long robes, candlelight, young minds expanding under the guidance of wise old scholars. Let me correct that for you. The robes were filthy, the candles smoked more than they shone, and the minds weren't expanding, they were cracking like dry parchment in a damp monastery. You weren't being taught to think, you were being trained to obey. So the next time you hear someone say school today is too soft, kindly remind them that medieval students didn't have recess. They had repentance, they didn't have teachers, they had punishers, and they didn't get homework, they got homilies. Every child's dream until you realise dreams were banned too. Still want to time travel? Go ahead. But pack some Latin flashcards, knee pads, and maybe a second soul. You're going to need it. If you think the phrase spare the rod spoil, the child was just a saying, welcome to medieval school where the rod was never spared and the child was always spoiled, with bruises. The rod wasn't symbolic. It was literal, long, and often lovingly carved by the teacher himself, as if preparing a personal wand for summoning pain. It wasn't hidden in a drawer or used as a threat. No, it was right there on the desk, like an honoured guest at the feast of your suffering. It was the medieval equivalent of a PowerPoint clicker, except it clicked directly on your knuckles. Discipline wasn't a part of education. It was the education. Forget learning through encouragement or curiosity, those were luxuries for the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, you learned through fear repetition and welts. Get a Latin declension wrong, whack. Drop your wax tablet, whack. Look like you're daydreaming about not being in class. That's 2 whacks, 1 for the thought and 1 for the audacity of hope. The rod made sure you never forgot the lesson, or your bruises. Corporal punishment wasn't just common, it was considered essential. A lazy child was seen as a moral failing, and pain was the holy bleach. It was purification, motivation, and classroom entertainment all rolled into one wooden stick. Teachers didn't keep count of how many times they hit a child. That would imply there was a limit. There wasn't. The line between discipline and sadism wasn't just blurred, it was enthusiastically danced upon in full monastic robes. There were many varieties of punishment tools, rods made from birch canes soaked in vinegar and even leather straps. Some schools used bundles of sticks tied together for maximum surface coverage. Others preferred thin reeds that stung like betrayal. The idea was to find that sweet spot between compliance and permanent damage, although sometimes they missed that sweet spot spectacularly. One story tells of a boy who misread a verse and lost hearing in one ear from a corrective slap. The monk who delivered it later called it a mercy. Humiliation was the cherry on top. After the beating, students were sometimes made to kneel on grains of barley or wear donkey ears made of parchment. Not metaphorically actual donkey ears. You became the class mascot of shame. The other children didn't laugh because it was funny. They laughed because it wasn't them. This wasn't just physical punishment, it was psychological warfare medieval edition. A crash course in shame before you even hit puberty. Even the church got in on it. Religious doctrine supported the use of physical punishment to drive out sin and laziness. After all, the body was temporary but the soul needed saving. So if bruising your behind meant saving your soul, the church approved. Whole manuals were written about proper disciplinary methods, when to strike, where to strike, and how to make sure the child feared God by the time the lesson was over. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, they said. And apparently fear of the rod came right after. Let's not pretend it was just the boys who got the rod. Girls, on the rare occasion they were allowed near any formal education, weren't exempt. Their punishments were just delivered with more condescension and fewer witnesses. They were taught to fear authority, be silent, and sew quietly, while memorising prayers with blistered palms. There's something about bleeding onto embroidery that really builds character, or so the nuns claimed. The worst part, the other students. Medieval school wasn't just teacher versus student, it was student versus student too. Older boys were often given the privilege of helping enforce discipline. They weren't hall monitors. They were junior enforcers, mini-inquisitors, equipped with their own sticks and a deep well of trauma to pass down. This wasn't mentoring. This was sanctioned bullying, where the cycle of violence was baked right into the curriculum like stale barley bread. And speaking of barley bread, try eating your lunch with swollen fingers and a face still hot from shame. The physical punishment didn't end when class did. You carried it with you to supper, to sleep into your dreams. It became your companion, like a medieval school-issued best friend, except it didn't comfort you, it made sure you never relaxed. Because relaxation led to softness, and softness led to heresy. And you wouldn't want to be a heretic now, would you? Now imagine this, you walk into class and the first thing you see is a student already crying. Not because anything's happened yet, but because he knows it will. The teacher arrives, places the rod on the table like a surgeon preparing for operation, and you all hold your breath. No one speaks. No one dares to blink too loud. The tension is so thick it could be spread on toast, if medieval toast existed, which it didn't. Toast requires comfort. This was a fear-based, carb-free environment. Did any of this actually help children learn better? Of course not. But it made them compliant, obedient, and mostly quiet. And that was the point. Learning was secondary. Control was primary. They weren't raising thinkers. They were raising quiet future monks and even quieter peasants. Questioning things was a punishable offence. Original thoughts were heretical. And joy, well, joy was suspicious and needed to be beaten out before it got ideas. Fast forward to today, and some people complain that kids have too much freedom in school. Let's be clear, the medieval idea of discipline was less about character building and more about trauma distribution. It wasn't a learning tool, it was an intimidation device. And it worked. Not because it inspired excellence, but because it inspired fear. You didn't want to be the smartest. You wanted to be the one who escaped notice. Some students cracked, others adapted. A rare few became teachers themselves, inheriting the same rod, the same room, and the same twisted sense of justice. Generational trauma in its purest form, passed down not with love, but with splinters. That's how medieval education stayed so consistent. Not through innovation, not through progress, but through pain. So next time you complain about your teacher giving you a bad grade, remember at least they didn't grade you with a stick. At least your report card doesn't come in the form of bruises. And at least you don't live in a world where the path to enlightenment starts with a beating and ends with a confession. Unless you're into that. In which case, congratulations. You would have made an excellent grammar school student in the 14th century. If you think school lunches today are bad, wait until you hear about the medieval version, also known as bring your own famine. There were no cafeterias, no vending machines, and definitely no chocolate milk. In fact, there wasn't much of anything except the constant gnawing ache of an empty stomach, and the occasional hope that today's lesson would end before you fainted. Medieval education came with no food, no breaks, and no sympathy. Hunger wasn't a problem, it was part of the curriculum. Students were expected to bring their own meals, which sounds fair until you remember that most families barely had enough to feed themselves, let alone their aspiring Latin scholars. If you were lucky, your mother packed a crust of black bread harder than your teacher's heart, maybe smeared with something that looked like butter, but smelled like goat. If you weren't lucky, you got nothing. And if you dared to complain, that earned you a lecture about the virtue of suffering or worse, another swing of the rod. There was no lunch hour. Meals, if they happened, were squeezed between endless prayers, rote recitations, and the occasional burst of punishment. You didn't eat when you were hungry. You ate when the teacher forgot to notice you still existed. Some schools operated under monastic rules where food was considered a temptation, and hunger was a spiritual training tool. Starvation wasn't neglect, it was holy character development. Monks who oversaw the schools often believed that denying children food would teach them discipline, After all, Christ fasted, so should you. Except Christ didn't have to chant Latin grammar for 6 hours while his stomach tried to digest its own lining. Some boys would chew on parchment or wax shavings just to keep their mouths busy and their nausea distracted. That is if they didn't get caught. Because chewing like joy was suspicious behaviour. The communal eating situation, when it did exist, wasn't much better. Imagine a long wooden table, scarred and stained, surrounded by pale-faced children who looked more corpse than student. You sat in silence. You ate in silence. You prayed in silence. And if you dropped a crumb, you watched it get carried away by a rat fatter than you'd ever be. The teacher, he had his own food, warm, private, possibly even with salt. Sharing was not encouraged. If you had food and someone else didn't, that was their test of virtue, not your cue to be kind. Charity was taught in theory, but practiced rarely. In the hierarchy of suffering, hunger was just another badge of honour. The hungriest student might be pitied, or mocked, or worst of all, ignored entirely as if hunger itself made you less human, not more in need. You might think, well, at least fasting helps you focus. It doesn't. It helps you hallucinate. A boy who hadn't eaten for 2 days might suddenly declare that he saw St. Jerome smiling at him from the corner, or that the Latin conjugation table started to dance. These weren't visions, these were symptoms, and yet no one questioned them. If anything, they were considered spiritual breakthroughs. Some students collapsed. Others simply drifted off mid-lesson, their heads bobbing forward like sad little sunflowers wilting in candlelight. Falling asleep in class wasn't met with concern, it was met with punishment. Because if you had the energy to faint, you clearly had the energy to repeat the Lord's Prayer in Latin backwards. The teacher's logic wasn't based on compassion. It was based on the unspoken rule that children existed to endure. For wealthier students, the story was slightly less tragic. Noble families might send along dried meats, cheese, or fruit wrapped carefully in cloth and sealed with wax. These students often sat a little straighter, smelled a little less desperate, and chewed a little louder than absolutely necessary. They became natural targets. Jealousy mixed with hunger creates a special kind of cruelty, and food envy ran deep in classrooms where half the kids had stomachs louder than their recitations. And then there was the food itself. Even when you had it, you wished you didn't. Medieval bread often contained fillers like ground-up bark, dried peas, or even powdered bone, yes, bone. In a time when flour was expensive, anything white and powdery got thrown in. And if you bit into your lunch and broke a tooth on a pebble or a rat's claw, tough luck. Dentistry didn't exist, unless you counted screaming while someone removed your molar with pliers from the blacksmith. Water. You're adorable. Medieval schools didn't have plumbing. The water nearby was likely contaminated with waste-rotting animals and questionable theological metaphors. If you drank it, you might be blessed, or dead. So students drank beer, weak watery beer, brewed specifically for children because at least it killed off some bacteria, which meant a schoolroom of slightly buzzed, very hungry kids trying to conjugate verbs without vomiting. And let's not forget fasting days. Every Friday, every saint's feast, every random holy day declared by the nearest monastery. On those days, food was not just absent, it was forbidden. Students were expected to attend class, sing psalms and debate scripture, while slowly dissolving into their own robes. Complaining about hunger was considered selfish. After all, weren't the saints hungry too? But even saints would have raised an eyebrow at the irony that a place meant for spiritual and mental growth treated nourishment like a sin. And in a twisted way it worked. Starving children don't rebel, they don't ask questions, they don't write revolutionary manifestos, they kneel, mumble their prayers and dream of crusts. Hunger wasn't just a symptom, it was a strategy. Of course, some children fought back in their own quiet, desperate ways, hiding food in sleeves, trading stolen eggs for shelter during storms, sneaking scraps from monastery kitchens under threat of excommunication. Small rebellions. quiet revolutions, all carried out by stomachs that couldn't wait until Sunday Mass to feel full again. So when modern students groan about cafeteria pizza being too chewy, or the apple juice tasting a little off, just remember their medieval counterparts would have fought each other to the death for a turnip, or a clean spoon, or a moment of kindness from someone who didn't measure compassion in calories. Because in the great medieval Hunger Games of education, there were no winners, only survivors. Some grew up, some grew bitter, and some grew very, very thin. Writing in medieval school wasn't about creativity. It was about not ruining the one precious thing your school actually owned, ink. Ink wasn't something that came in a neat plastic cartridge. It was alchemy, pain, and prayer, all blended together in a sticky mess of soot, gall vinegar, and sometimes blood. Yes, blood. Some recipes were known to include rust or wine, or if your school was particularly poor and most were whatever happened to be dark and vaguely liquid. This meant that every single drop mattered. One spill, one careless flick of the quill, and you weren't just clumsy, you were a heretic in the eyes of the schoolmaster. Forget modern notebooks or crisp white paper. Medieval students had wax tablets if they were lucky, slates if they were blessed, and scrap parchment if the gods were truly smiling. Parchment wasn't cheap. It was made from animal skins and treated with so much lime that it smelled like a butcher's workshop. And don't even dream of turning the page like in a modern book. Most children didn't get entire books. They got fragments, a corner of a copied prayer, half a hymn, and they were expected to treat that scrap like a holy relic, because it was. Now enter the quill, feathered, fickle and moody as a sleep-deprived monk. You didn't just use a quill, you negotiated with it. One side too sharp and it tore the page. Too dull and it smeared like a sad inkwash painting. Every few lines you had to sharpen it with a penknife, and one wrong cut meant it split and you were done. Writing became an exercise in patient skill, and the steady hand of someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days, but still needed to copy the Nicene Creed by sunset. Mistakes weren't allowed. There was no such thing as oops in medieval classrooms. A misplaced line could cost you an hour of rewriting. And if you smudged the ink that wasn't just sloppy, it was blasphemous. You were defiling the word of God after all, or worse, making the teacher's personal copy of the grammar rules look messy. Correction fluid didn't exist. Your options were scraping the parchment with a knife and hoping no one noticed or saying goodbye to your fingernails. Copying text wasn't just a school exercise, it was the school exercise. Repetition was how students learned line after line of Latin prayers copied until their wrist throbbed and their eyes blurred. And if you were left-handed, congratulations. You were now suspicious, possibly possessed, and expected to retrain your devil hand. Ambidextrous, don't even mention it. That was a quick route to the local exorcist. There was no margin for flair style or creativity. Medieval script had rules, height, spacing, curl, direction, and breaking them was a punishable offence. And just to keep things spicy, different monasteries and schools had different script styles. So if your family moved, you had to unlearn everything and start over. Think of it like changing schools today, except your handwriting could literally get you punished for being from the wrong diocese. If you were tasked with copying scripture or religious commentary, the pressure was even worse. Every word had to be perfect. Every line had to be justified. Errors weren't seen as academic failings, they were moral ones. Writing angel instead of angle in a theological tract might land you a week's worth of penance. And if you dared abbreviate a word to save time or ink, you'd better hope the teacher was too tired to beat the holy syllables out of you. Storage was another drama altogether. There were no pencil cases. If you wanted to keep your quill safe, you tucked it into your tunic or, more likely, carried it in your mouth like a dog with a stick. Ink was stored in animal horn inkwells, fragile, leaky, and a prime target for accidental sabotage by jealous classmates. There was nothing more devastating than discovering your ink had dried out overnight because the cap fell off, or worse, Someone accidentally sneezed in it. And let's talk lighting. Writing was rarely done in bright sun-drenched rooms. Most schools were dim-dank and lit with either smoky candles or narrow slits of light filtering through thick, grimy windows. You didn't just strain your wrist writing, you strained your eyes trying to see what you were writing. By the age of 12, many students had the squint of a 70-year-old monk and the posture of a question mark. Scribes, who were the professional older version of these children, often died blind, bent and bitter. They were the saints of patience men who spent their entire lives copying texts so that others could read them and promptly misinterpret them. Medieval schools were factories for these future scribes. Your childhood was essentially a long audition for a life of ink stains, backaches, and the gentle hum of Gregorian chants lulling you into arthritis. And let's not forget the ink stains, permanent of course. If you spilled ink on your tunic, that was your tunic now. You wore it like a badge of shame, a medieval scarlet letter that screamed I had one job and I ruined it. Some students tried to hide the stains with patches. Others wore them proudly like academic battle wounds. A few claimed the blots were artistic flourishes. They didn't last long. All of this, the fragile ink, the awful tools, the maddening repetition, was designed not to help you express yourself, but to help you disappear. Medieval schooling wasn't about becoming more of yourself. It was about becoming less visible, less noisy, less curious, more obedient, more quiet, more prepared to live a life where writing would be your only voice, and even then only if it was the right script, the right spelling and the right prayer. So next time your ballpoint pen runs out and you sigh dramatically, just imagine it's 1342. You've spent 40 minutes brewing ink from soot and mould. You sit hunched over a scrap of parchment made from a sheep's stomach. Your quill splits, your ink freezes, the candle blows out. Your teacher thinks that's hilarious, and you laugh too quietly because if you don't, you might start crying, and crying unfortunately smudges the ink. There was no official job title called human printer, but in medieval schools that's what you were training to become. The most successful students didn't graduate into glory. They graduated into the monastery's scriptorium, where their future was written out in spine pain and eye strain. Becoming a scribe wasn't a promotion. It was a sentence. A lifetime of bending over thick animal skin pages, your nose an inch from ink that smelled like vinegar and despair, while your back slowly folded into a question mark no one ever answered. The scribe's posture wasn't a style, it was a condition. Centuries before ergonomic chairs, you sat on a hard wooden bench hunched over your writing desk, like a gargoyle with arthritis. No cushions, no lumbar support, just your own determination, and a constant reminder that comfort was the devil's playground. Over time, your shoulders curled inwards, your neck fused into a permanent downward tilt, and your spine resembled the curvature of a sad, broken harp. Congratulations, you had joined the sacred order of the Hunchbacks of Holy Ink. If you were particularly devout or just unlucky, you might spend 12 to 14 hours a day copying texts. Not writing, copying. You weren't allowed to embellish, paraphrase, or daydream. Your job was to be invisible, a ghost behind the quill, a hand with no personality. If your script was too decorative, you were vain. If it was too sloppy, you were sinful. And if it was too slow, you were replaceable. Mistakes weren't just frowned upon, they were immortalized. One slip of the quill and you might accidentally turn peace into plague. And in a time where people interpreted errors as divine messages, that single blotch could start a theological argument or a panic attack, scribes often added notes in the margins like, "I am very tired," or "This ink is bad," or in one famous case, "Oh, for the love of God, this is the end." Those weren't jokes. They were cries for help, written in perfect Gothic script. The lighting was of course terrible. Candles flickered, oil lamps smoked, windows, when there were any, letting cold air and very little light. You spent your days squinting through fog and flame, trying to distinguish an E from a C, before your vision dissolved into static. Some scribes went blind. Others simply forgot what daylight looked like. Their only reprieve was the moment they looked up and realized it was night. Again. The materials didn't make things easier. You had to prepare your own parchment cutting and scraping animal skins until they were thin and flat. The process stank literally. It involved lime urine and a lot of prayers that the dog next door wouldn't eat your work. And then came the ink, thick and sticky, often clumping in the quill or dripping at the worst possible moment. A smudge wasn't a small mistake, it was a financial disaster. Parchment was expensive. You couldn't just flip to the next page and start over. That page might have taken 3 days to prepare. Your fingers were always stained, your nails always chipped. Ink found its way into your cuticles, under your sleeves, onto your face. You learned to stop noticing. You learned to live with the smell of mouldy vellum and scorched wick. You learned that your handwriting was the only thing people would ever see of you, and that your body would pay the price for every neat, straight, holy line you drew. No one would remember your face, but they'd remember your flawless calligraphy on Psalm 91. And this wasn't just religious work. Oh no. You were expected to copy everything: laws, medical treatises, tax records, royal decrees. One day it was the Gospel of Luke, the next it was a list of livestock owed by peasants to their lord. Each word required concentration, and each page ended with you stretching your neck like an owl with regrets. Every letter was an injury waiting to happen. Repetitive strain injury wasn't diagnosed, it was life. Illuminated manuscripts were the glamorous side of scribing, but don't be fooled. While the final product looks beautiful, the process was anything but. Painting those tiny gold leaf initials took hours of work, with brushes made from squirrel hair and colours ground from semi-precious stones. It was delicate, tedious, and mentally exhausting. One sneeze and your entire week's work glittered across the wrong saint's face. Then it was back to the penknife, the prayers, and the parchment. Breaks were rare. Meals were plain. Talking was discouraged. Joy was banned. The only thing that kept most scribes going was the idea that their suffering was holy, that their crooked backs and ink-blind eyes were offerings to God, that maybe, just maybe, someone would read their work and be changed. Of course, most texts were locked away or misfiled in dusty libraries no one ever visited. But hope like ink is hard to erase completely. Even outside the monastery and the few secular schools that existed, the scribal grind was nearly identical. Poorer children who showed talent with penmanship were often recruited voluntarily or otherwise into scribal apprenticeships. It sounded prestigious until you realised it meant living in a dark corner of a room copying someone else's words for the rest of your natural life. Or until your hands gave out, or your eyes failed, or your lungs filled with parchment dust and you coughed yourself into a grave behind the school. The term scribe's hunchback eventually became shorthand for anyone twisted, tired, and too valuable to throw away. These weren't celebrated scholars. They were the backbone literally of medieval knowledge preservation. Anonymous, bent, ink-covered wretches who worked so you could one day read this sentence and feel smug about your keyboard. So next time you complain about typing for 2 hours straight, or edit in a Google Doc picture this you, in a freezing room on a stool made of splinters with nothing but a feather, and a sheep's skin hunched over like a shrimp praying for death. You've written the same sentence 17 times. You blink and the candle sputters, your back screams, your fingers bleed. You smile because at least it's not Latin. Yet, if you were a girl in the Middle Ages and dreamed of learning how to read, write, or even just count past your toes, well, sweetie, you'd better be born to a lord or sent to a convent. Because medieval education didn't have room for ovaries. The unofficial school motto was simple: boys learn, girls churn, as in churn butter. And maybe your own fate if you were lucky enough to avoid becoming a cautionary tale in a saint's biography. Education was a gated garden, and girls weren't even allowed to peek through the hedge unless, of course, they had money, noble blood, or a lifelong commitment to celibacy. For most girls, school was not a building. It was the home, the field, the workshop. Their curriculum consisted of how to survive childbirth without dying, and how to sew until your fingers bleed and you still smile. They didn't get Latin grammar, they got Latin mass with no subtitles. Most couldn't understand a word being said and no one cared. Because reading was dangerous, writing even more so. A literate woman was a suspicious woman, and a suspicious woman had one foot in the witch trial already. But not all hope was lost if your family was noble, and your father didn't see your brain as a threat. Wealthy girls might be assigned a private tutor, or sent to a nunnery where education came served cold with a side of chastity. The content, religious texts, moral tales, how to behave properly when a man speaks, and the occasional bit of basic arithmetic, so you wouldn't embarrass yourself when calculating your dowry. You were taught to read scripture but never interpret it. God forbid a woman think for herself. That was theology's worst nightmare. And speaking of nunneries, these were the Ivy Leagues for medieval women, minus the ivy and plus a lot of vows. Life in a convent wasn't easy, but at least it offered some women access to books, libraries, and a life that didn't revolve around giving birth until your hips gave out. Some nuns became respected scholars, writers, and even composers. Others were locked in small stone rooms with a single candle and told to meditate on humility. It was a spiritual upgrade from being someone's childbearing machine, but just barely. Outside of the cloistered walls, things were rough. If a peasant girl showed signs of intelligence, her reward was more chores. Quick with numbers, great count the eggs. Good with words, perfect recite the market prices. Her education was practical, silent and unacknowledged. No diplomas, no ceremonies. Just the quiet knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, how to survive in a world that didn't think your thoughts mattered. Now imagine a boy and a girl born in the same village on the same day. He gets a chance to go to school, chant Latin, learn to write his name. She gets to wash his tunic, make his food, and pray he doesn't die of dysentery before marrying age. Their futures were drawn in ink and blood before either could spell their own names. And if she did learn to write, if she taught herself in secret, or convinced a kind priest to teach her letters, she had to keep it quiet. Because a literate woman was viewed the way we now view someone who reads conspiracy forums at 3 a.m, with a mix of fear, fascination, and a deep need to walk away. And God help the girl who actually liked books. She'd be labelled unnatural, unfeminine, or unfit for marriage. Because nothing kills medieval romance faster than a woman correcting your Latin during courtship. For the very rare girl who pursued knowledge openly, her life was one long defence against suspicion. Why was she so curious? What was she planning? Was she using her reading skills to summon the devil or worse, form opinions? You could say that education for girls in the Middle Ages was a bit like a locked room. Technically there was a key, but it was hidden, cursed and guarded by a monk who thought menstruation was a sin. And if by some miracle you made it in, you better not speak too loudly about what you learned. Humility was enforced, pride was punished. And forgetting your place in the grand gender hierarchy, that was an offence punishable by isolation, shame, or marriage, which in some cases were the same thing. Even noble girls, the supposed winners in this twisted system, were taught education as ornament, not empowerment. You learned to read just enough to write love letters or religious dedications, but not enough to challenge the men in your life. Your knowledge was like perfume, subtle, sweet, and never overpowering. You could be clever in that way. Small dogs are clever. But God forbid you wanted to debate someone. That wasn't clever, that was hysterical. And you know how medieval medicine treated hysteria with herbs, isolation, or leeches? Lots and lots of leeches. In the rarest cases, women broke through. Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, powerhouses of thought defying expectations, writing, preaching, composing. But they were exceptions that proved the rule women could be educated as long as they did it quietly, beautifully, and preferably in Latin verse that no peasant man would bother reading. Their legacy is a whisper in the thunderstorm of forgotten girls whose names never made it to parchment, And let's not pretend modern times are free of this shadow. The echoes of girls don't need that still linger. But back then it wasn't an opinion, it was policy. Education was seen as a ladder, and girls were told to stay at the bottom and cheer for the boys as they climbed. Unless, of course, the girl was rich enough to buy a step, or holy enough to pray one into existence. So next time someone says medieval women didn't do much, remind them that they weren't allowed to. They weren't idle, they were excluded. Their minds weren't empty, they were ignored. And their silence wasn't compliance, it was survival. Every girl who learned to read in secret, who listened from the hallway, who asked why, and got slapped for it, that was resistance. Written not in ink, but in effort, in hunger, in pain. And to every girl who dreamed of books but got a broom instead, who asked for paper but got a prayer, who reached for knowledge and was told, no, that's not for you, we remember you. Even if history tried to forget. If you thought your school's sex education class was awkward, try learning about the birds and the bees from a red-faced monk who believed touching your own elbow was a gateway to hell. There was no formal sex education in medieval schools. There was no informal one either, unless you count terrifying metaphors, vague threats, and an unhealthy obsession with eternal fire. In the medieval classroom, sex wasn't taught. It was warned about, like wolves, or plague, or women who wore their hair uncovered. The official curriculum on human reproduction was simple don't. Don't ask, don't wonder, don't think about it, and for God's sake, don't do it. Unless you were married, procreating, and preferably cloaked in guilt and shame while doing so. Even then you were supposed to feel terrible about it. Pleasure wasn't just frowned upon, it was tracked, catalogued, and condemned in enough Latin phrases to fill a dozen sermons. Lust was a sin. Curiosity was a sin. Understanding your own body, absolutely a sin. Students, especially boys, were told that their desires were a test, that their bodies were landmines planted by Satan, that even looking at a girl too long might trigger an avalanche of sin that ended in damnation, blindness, or worse, confession. Masturbation was described as self-defilement, a crime not only against God but against the angels, the saints, and probably the local baker. No one was quite sure how the mechanics worked, but that didn't stop everyone from having strong opinions on how wrong it was. Girls, of course, got even less information unless they were in a convent where the main lesson was that their bodies were temples, and anyone who dared enter without divine paperwork was a defiler, a serpent, or both. The virginity of girls wasn't just a moral expectation, it was an economic asset, a spiritual badge and a social landmine. A girl who lost it outside marriage wasn't just ruined, she was erased, disgraced, possibly locked away, possibly blamed for tempting someone because women were seen as both weak and dangerously powerful, which is a neat trick if you think about it. There was no talk of anatomy, hygiene, or consent. Instead, students were taught about sin temptation and how the devil liked to whisper from under skirts and behind bushes. Puberty wasn't explained, it was punished. A boy whose voice cracked might be laughed at, beaten, or accused of pride. A girl who bled for the first time might be told she was now of age and therefore must double her prayers and lower her eyes. No celebration, no support, just shame cloaked in incense and regret. And it gets worse. Many teachers genuinely believed that education about sex caused sin, that merely discussing the existence of bodies would awaken foul desires in young minds. So instead of instruction, students got silence. Instead of knowledge, they got fear. Instead of biology, they got bad theology, full of contradictions and half-quoted saints. St. Augustine was particularly popular in this department, famously describing his own youthful urges as a tempest of filth. He may have exaggerated, but medieval teachers treated it like gospel. When students did get education about sexual matters, it was usually in the form of moral stories, cautionary tales soaked in fire and brimstone, like the young monk who looked at a woman's ankle and spontaneously combusted, or the girl who danced too close to the church gates and was swallowed whole by the earth. These stories weren't science. They were bedtime horror stories designed to make you terrified of your own anatomy. If you were noble and your family hired a private tutor, there might be a little more nuance. But even then, it was wrapped in metaphors so dense you needed divine intervention to interpret them. A penis might be referred to as a staff of duty, a vagina, the gate of wifely submission, and sex itself was the union of obligation under the Lord's observation. The only thing students truly learned was how to talk about bodies without saying anything. And of course, if you did have questions, real honest biological questions, you kept them buried deep, where even God couldn't hear them. Asking a teacher could land you in the stocks. Asking a priest could land you in confession. Asking another student could land you in sin. And sin, as everyone knew, was a one-way ticket to the boiling pits. There was no such thing as a safe space, only a silent space. And even that was filled with suspicion. Meanwhile, nature went on doing its thing. Boys experienced wet dreams and thought they were cursed. Girls started menstruating and assumed they were dying. There were no pamphlets, no discussions, no diagrams, just shock, fear and whispers. Entire generations entered adulthood with no real understanding of how anything worked, just the certainty that whatever it was wrong. In rare cases, schools taught about reproduction in the context of animal husbandry. Farmers' sons learned how to breed pigs and cows, but drawing any parallels to humans was strictly taboo. It was fine to help a goat give birth, but mention a woman's pregnancy, and suddenly the room went cold. The hypocrisy was breathtaking and entirely normal. Clerics wrote long tracts about sexual sin, often obsessing over details that no child had even thought of, until they were exposed to the clergy's wild imaginations. The same men who refused to teach children basic anatomy would write 200-page documents on the sinfulness of nocturnal emissions. And the cycle continued. Ignorance bred fear. Fear bred shame. Shame bred silence. And silence, of course, bred more ignorance. The result? A medieval population that stumbled into marriage with the sexual literacy of confused goats. Many brides didn't know what sex was until it happened. Some grooms weren't sure where things went. Consummation was a confusing mess of guilt, prayer, and possibly the supervision of a priest standing nearby to make sure it was done properly. No joke. That actually happened. Because if God was going to judge your wedding night better, make sure you had a witness in a robe and sandals, and still no one questioned it. Because to question was to invite suspicion. To desire knowledge was to flirt with sin, and to want to understand your body was the first step on a long road toward heresy, licentiousness, and worst of all, thinking for yourself. So next time someone rolls their eyes at modern sex, I'd remind them, education isn't what ruins innocence, ignorance does. In the Middle Ages, kids didn't learn less about sex because it was holy. They learned less because the people in charge were terrified of their own desires, and because control was easier when everyone was confused, ashamed, and afraid of touching themselves literally or intellectually. Knowledge is power, and back then they didn't just withhold it, they demonized it, wrapped it in guilt, buried it in fear, and called it virtue. Medieval school had one true language, and no, it wasn't the language of love or reason or anything remotely useful in daily peasant life. It was Latin. Pure, stiff ecclesiastical Latin, spoken by no one in real life, understood by even fewer, and memorized by terrified children under the watchful eye of a man who thought smiles were the devil's invention. If you couldn't recite Latin, you couldn't learn. If you couldn't learn, you couldn't pray properly. And if you couldn't pray properly well, enjoy your eternal damnation with a side of grammatical errors. From day one, children were expected to chant Latin phrases like they were casting spells because honestly it felt that way. They didn't know what the words meant. Most teachers didn't bother translating. Meaning was optional. Recitation was mandatory. The key to success wasn't comprehension, it was volume. If you could drone out Paternoster, Kies and Caelus louder than your classmates, you were winning. Bonus points if your voice didn't crack and you didn't cry halfway through the third repetition. Latin wasn't just a subject, it was a filter, a wall, a test of loyalty. The church operated in Latin. Laws were written in Latin. The educated elite whispered behind closed doors in Latin, and if you couldn't speak it, you weren't part of the conversation. You were an outsider, an illiterate, a spiritual liability. It didn't matter if you knew how to build a barn, raise 5 siblings, and keep chickens alive in a plague. If you didn't know your declensions, you were considered dumb and doomed. There was no Latin for beginners. There was only full immersion, the kind where you drown slowly in a sea of verbs and get smacked every time you mispronounce filioque. You didn't start with hello or where is the bathroom. You started with the soul is eternal and must be purified by divine grace. Try spelling purificatio while your stomach is growling and the teacher's eye is twitching. It's character building and spine wrecking. Grammar drills were the main event. Imagine chanting conjugations for hours while your fingers go numb from cold and your mind goes numb from terror. Amo amas, amat amamus, amatis amant. Over and over until you forgot what the word love meant, assuming you ever knew in the first place. If you mixed up third-person singular with first-person plural, the correction wasn't a gentle nudge. It was usually a sharp reminder delivered via cane glare or public shame. And let's be honest, Latin is not user-friendly. The rules are endless. The exceptions are cruel. Word order irrelevant. Everything changes depending on the mood-tense gender case and which way the wind is blowing. You could spend weeks mastering a single sentence only to find out the monk prefers a different translation. Then it's back to zero. No sympathy, no second chances, just a fresh sheet of parchment and the creeping sense that God himself doesn't even like grammar. The strangest part. The vast majority of students would never use Latin outside the school walls. Their families spoke the local dialect. Their neighbours traded in grunts and gestures. Latin was a foreign tongue designed to keep knowledge in the hands of the few. It was never meant to be practical, it was meant to be powerful. So while kids learned how to say the bishop is in the sanctuary, they didn't know how to ask where the bread was, or what time it was, or how to politely say, "Please stop hitting me." Yet despite its uselessness, Latin was sacred, holy, eternal. It was the language of the scriptures and therefore unquestionable. Questioning Latin was like questioning the Bible. It didn't go well. One poor boy who asked, "Why don't we learn to read in our own language?" was reportedly made to copy the Psalms backward as punishment, in Latin, with no food, while standing. The teacher called it humility training. The student called it the worst day of my life, probably in broken Latin. Teachers didn't teach Latin. They inflicted it. Most of them were barely fluent themselves, but they knew enough to lord it over their terrified students. And if they couldn't explain a rule, they blamed the student for being too sinful to understand. It wasn't a failure of instruction. It was a failure of character. You didn't just misread the ablative case you offended heaven. Some students surprisingly excelled. They had a gift. A cruel, uncanny ability to memorize and regurgitate Latin phrases like a sanctified parrot. These students were adored by the teachers and despised by everyone else. They were the future monks, scribes, and grammar tyrants of tomorrow. They didn't flinch during recitations. They didn't smudge ink. They didn't cry when the teacher corrected their syntax in front of the class. They smiled. Those kids were terrifying. And heaven help the child who dared to learn another language. Vernaculars. French, English, German, Italian were considered vulgar, lesser, corrupt. Speaking them in class was punished. Reading them was discouraged. Writing in them, heretical. You learned Latin because Latin was God's favourite. Your own tongue was for pigs and drunkards. Literacy didn't count unless it came with ecclesiastical approval, and at least 3 layers of Latin suffixes. Of course, not everyone made it through. Some students cracked. Some pretended to understand and mumbled their way to safety. Others faked illness, ran away, or quietly faded into illiteracy. But those who endured, Those who could survive 12-hour days of chanting, memorizing, reciting, copying, and getting hit for blinking during Gloria Patri. They earned the right to be bored at sermons in a language they finally understood. Looking back, it's clear that Latin education wasn't about building minds. It was about building walls, between classes, between clergy and commoners, between knowledge and the people who might use it to ask uncomfortable questions. It was the perfect gatekeeper, beautiful, ancient, and utterly unforgiving. So next time someone tells you Latin is a dead language, remind them it may be dead, but it took thousands of childhoods with it. Buried beneath the weight of conjugations behind chapel walls under stacks of decaying parchment. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it whispering, Disce aut morere. Learn or die trying. Education in the Middle Ages came with a scent, a pungent, unmistakable blend of mildew sweat, candle smoke, spoiled porridge, and unwashed humanity. Step into a medieval classroom, and your nose got educated before your brain did. There were no air fresheners, no ventilation systems, and certainly no concept of personal hygiene. The air was thick, stale, and vaguely wet. It clung to your clothes, your skin, your soul. And if you were lucky enough to survive the grammar drills, you'd still go home reeking of medieval enlightenment, which smelled remarkably like mouldy wool and desperation. You might assume that schools were cleaned. They were about as often as someone bathed, which was to say rarely and under great duress. Most classrooms were stone-walled chambers with dirt or rush-covered floors that soaked up everything: spilled ink, dropped food, rat droppings, sick child vomit, and occasionally blood. Rushes were meant to be changed every few weeks. In practice, they stayed until they disintegrated into compost beneath your feet. So when you knelt to pray or leaned over to fetch your quill, you weren't just meeting God, you were face to face with 3 months' worth of microbial nightmares. Now let's talk students. Hygiene wasn't a subject, it was a myth. Bathing was seasonal at best, and hair washing was practically blasphemy. Children came to school coated in the evidence of their home lives, soot from the hearth grease from their single shared meal and whatever farm animal had recently sneezed on them. Lice was so common they had nicknames. Nits were traded like playground gossip. Teachers didn't try to fix it. They just tried not to scratch too loudly. Add to that the wardrobe situation: one set of clothing per child, rarely washed, never changed unless absolutely necessary. Wool tunics soaked up every odour and amplified them with time. Socks, if they existed, were stiff, damp, and evolving into sentient life forms. Cloaks carried the aroma of smoke and mildew. Boots reeked of damp earth, spoiled leather, and foot rot. Sitting shoulder to shoulder in a cramped candlelit room with 20 other equally fragrant souls that wasn't school. That was medieval aromatherapy, except instead of lavender it was barnyard anxiety. The teacher wasn't exempt either. He might have worn robes, but don't mistake those flowing garments for cleanliness. Underneath was a man who hadn't bathed since Lent smelled like sanctified mould and breathed coffee-scented prayers from lungs full of candle soot. His breath, a potent mix of stale beer and ecclesiastical authority, could knock over a stack of parchment. He judged your grammar harshly, but your hygiene even more so, mostly because your stench reminded him of his own. Lighting didn't help. Candles made of tallow-red animal fat filled the room with a smoky, greasy fog. The scent of slow-cooked sheep fat hung in the air like a grim halo. Soot covered walls, books and lungs. If you left the classroom without a hacking cough and a layer of waxy residue on your sleeves, congratulations, you didn't breathe. And then there were the animals. Yes, animals! Cats wandered in and out, tolerated for their rat-hunting prowess, but unwelcome when they decided to give birth under the lectern. Dogs slunk through sniffing lunch scraps. Chickens occasionally flapped in, lost from home and loudly outraged by grammar recitations. And rats, well rats, were permanent students. They chewed on scrolls, scurried through rushes, and occasionally dropped down from rafters to offer their own interpretations of the Psalms. Toilets. That's adorable. There were no toilets. At best, there was a hole dug outside or a shared chamber pot that no one ever wanted to be responsible for emptying. Some schools were lucky enough to be built near a stream where students could relieve themselves in the cold, damp embrace of nature's latrine. Others used the alley, or the floor, or nothing. Holding it in was part of the spiritual discipline, and when someone got sick, which was often you didn't send them home, you moved them to the side of the room, covered them with a blanket, and kept chanting Latin. Vomiting was handled with a bucket if available, or the nearest corner. Sneezing was treated as a potential sign of plague, but also as a moral failing. You should have prayed harder, the teacher might mutter, offering a slap instead of sympathy. The smells of illness mixed beautifully with the constant human odours. Fevers produced sweat which fermented under wool. Infected cuts oozed through bandages made of old cloth. Rashes festered. Snot ran freely. Everyone shared everything from lice to leprosy. Disease was part of the curriculum, and if you died, you got a prayer, burial, and immediate replacement. The classroom must go on. Books and writing materials had their own perfuming mould, mildew, and the occasional whiff of preserved animal skin. Old manuscripts held the smell of death inked into their very fibres. You weren't just reading theology, you were inhaling it, deeply, and probably absorbing centuries of mould spores into your lungs in the process. Food didn't help. Whatever students brought with them, cheese-dried meat, fermented vegetables, only added to the olfactory orgy. Lunch smelled like regret and was often shared with the rats. Spoiled milk left forgotten in the corner could bloom into a terrifying experiment, and the occasional communal pot of porridge imagined grain water and disappointment boiled together until they became a smell. That was lunch. Sometimes the smell got so bad the teacher would open a window if there was one. It made no difference. The outside world smelled just as bad, if not worse. The town reeked of smoke, sewage, and dead things. So the classroom in all its steaming horror was still considered indoors, safe, sacred, slightly less foul than the rest of the world. But here's the truly terrifying part: they got used to it. The nose, ever the loyal servant, simply gave up. After a few hours you stopped noticing the stench of death, disease, and despair. You stopped gagging at the rot. You started to accept it. And that perhaps was the most medieval thing of all, adjusting to suffering so completely that it felt normal. So next time your classroom smells a little funky, someone forgot gym clothes, maybe there's a weird sandwich in the trash, remember your medieval ancestors. They studied by candle smoke in rooms filled with lice and rot, while rats critiqued their penmanship. They smelled like regret wrapped in wool, and didn't even have deodorant to pretend otherwise. And yet they learned. Not because the environment was inspiring, but because the alternative was worse. There's a reason medieval students knew more saints than siblings. Every wall, every lesson, every sneeze was accompanied by a reminder that the saints were watching and they were not impressed. Saints weren't presented as role models of gentle inspiration. They were spiritual overachievers with a flair for dramatic suffering. One had their eyes gouged out and still recited the Psalms. Another was burned, flayed, and somehow found the time to convert their executioner. The message was clear unless you were willing to endure extreme agony with a smile. Your place in heaven was questionable at best. School became a boot camp for saintly imitation. Students were encouraged, no expected, to endure humiliation, hunger and beatings as a form of moral polish. Suffering wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Pain became proof of virtue. Complaining, a sign of spiritual weakness. Crying, a possible sign of demonic possession. And if you flinched when the rod came down, you clearly lacked the conviction of St. Lawrence, who was grilled alive and told his torturers to flip him over. True story. Now sit down, stop whining, and recite your Latin verbs. Every week brought a different saint's feast day, and with it a new collection of gruesome bedtime stories. These weren't sweet tales of divine guidance. These were medieval horror shows with halos. You learned about St. Catherine being broken on a wheel, St. Bartholomew being skinned alive, St. Agnes being dragged naked through the streets and still managing to keep her virtue, and you meanwhile couldn't even memorize the 10 Commandments without stuttering. Shame on you. This constant comparison did wonders for morale. Nothing says self-esteem like being told you'll never be as holy as a 13-year-old martyr who smiled while being disemboweled. Teachers used saints like medieval motivational posters, except instead of saying, "hang in there," they said St. Cecilia didn't scream when they cut off her head, and you're crying over a spelling mistake. Students quickly learned to associate virtue with silence compliance and a very high pain tolerance. And then there were the beatdowns, not just for mistakes, but for posture attitude, breathing wrong, or the cardinal sin of existing during the wrong mood. Discipline was sudden and unpredictable, which made it extra effective. You never knew if a forgotten prayer would earn you a scolding or a slap. One minute you were calmly reciting Credo in Unum Deum, and the next your ears were ringing from the sting of divine disappointment, delivered by Brother Benedict's open palm. Punishment wasn't just physical, it was theatrical. A student who misbehaved might be forced to kneel on dried peas for an hour, or wear a wooden sign that read Donkey of the Week, or stand in front of a statue of St. Jerome while reciting, "I am proud and full of sin" 20 times out loud with rhythm like a shameful Gregorian chant. The goal wasn't correction, it was purification. You weren't being educated, you were being exercised one mistake at a time. Some schools even had designated correction corners places so soaked in fear that students claimed to hear whispering saints or the weeping of past victims. Whether or not the saints actually approved of such methods was irrelevant. The Church did, and the Church wrote the rules. If a child left class with bruises, it wasn't abuse, it was discipline in the Lord. If a child passed out during fasting and study, it was spiritual refinement. And if a child died, well, perhaps they'd reached sainthood. Of course, not all teachers were monsters. Some genuinely believed they were helping. They saw themselves as midwives of salvation, birthing holy men and women through the trauma of education. They quoted scripture-invoked saints and offered corrections with the calm serenity of someone who believed suffering was sacred. To them, every bruise was a blessing, every tear was a step closer to heaven, and every terrified silence was proof that the lesson was sinking in. This sanctification of pain created an environment where even kindness was suspect. A teacher who smiled too often was viewed as soft. A student who laughed risked being accused of vanity or pride. Joy had to be hidden. Friendship was fragile. Trust was a gamble. Every moment became a performance of piety, and if you broke character, the saints were watching, always watching. Especially St. Benedict, who was known for his strict rule and occasional spontaneous miracles, usually involving someone getting disciplined by divine lightning. Saint relics sometimes made surprise appearances just to keep everyone nervous. A piece of bone in a glass case, a vial of saintly blood, a strip of cloth that once touched someone who may have met St. Francis. These holy items were paraded through the classroom like sacred trophies. You weren't allowed to sneeze near them, let alone question their authenticity. And if a student fainted in their presence, that was a sign, a miracle, a divine endorsement of the curriculum. Meanwhile, your spiritual progress was carefully monitored, not with grades, but with guilt. Had you sinned in your heart? Had you thought a lustful thought? Had you failed to admire the courage of St. Lucy, who plucked out her own eyes to avoid marriage? Confess it. Confess it now. Or Brother Matthew might remind you with the flat side of a wooden cross. Even prayers became tools of punishment. You weren't just saying them, you were being judged by the tone, the speed, and the passion behind each word. Mumble too fast, you were disrespectful. Too slow, you were lazy. Too loud, you were prideful. There was no right way, only less wrong ways, each one guarded by the looming threat of holy reprimand. And if the saints heard you mess up well, maybe you'd just be cursed with chronic misfortune. Nothing serious, just a life of bad luck, loneliness, and eternal regret. Eventually, students learned to internalise the system. They beat themselves up before the teachers could. They apologised for sins they hadn't committed. They whispered prayers in their sleep. They dreamed of being holy, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was too terrifying. Heaven wasn't a reward. It was a relief. A final escape from the eternal medieval schoolroom of guilt, fear, and enforced reverence. So next time someone says kids today are too sensitive, tell them about the time little Thomas got a nosebleed from a flying crucifix because he nodded off during the martyrdom of St. Stephen. Or the time Sister Marguerite made a child stand barefoot in the snow to understand the chill of moral failure. Or the day an entire class was denied lunch because one boy smiled during morning prayers. Medieval education wasn't about learning, it was about survival, and the saints with all their bleeding eyes and broken bones weren't just in the textbooks. They were in the air, on the walls, in every lesson, every strike, every whispered amen. In modern classrooms, asking questions is encouraged. In medieval classrooms, it was a crime against God grammar and the fragile ego of Brother Benedict. Questions weren't seen as signs of curiosity, they were seen as backtalk arrogance or heresy, depending on the teacher's mood and how recently they'd eaten. Why does the verb end like that earned you a glare? What does this word mean might get you accused of spiritual laziness? And why do we have to learn Latin if no one speaks it well? That was practically a declaration of war. You didn't ask questions in medieval school. You endured, you copied, you recited, you suffered. Asking a question was like throwing a rock into a very shallow, very angry pond. The splash wasn't big, but the ripples of punishment went on for days. Teachers didn't interpret questions as engagement. They saw them as a personal affront. If God had wanted you to know the answer, he would have carved it on your heart, or at least written it in a Latin manuscript you couldn't afford. Even innocent questions could lead to trouble. Can I go to the privy? Wrong tone, wrong timing, wrong audience. Suddenly you're kneeling on a cold stone floor with a wax tablet strapped to your hands and a warning not to defile the sacred silence. And you still had to hold it. Another classic. Is it true that the saints could fly? Technically, yes, some were said to levitate. But if your question came with the slightest smirk, congratulations, you were now that student. The one who doubted miracles. The one who might need a little spiritual correction with a stick. Then there were the trick questions, the ones you didn't even know were dangerous. Like, how do we know the earth doesn't move? Or why is Greek bad but Latin good? These weren't questions. These were academic landmines. Step on one and your classmates would immediately lean away as if your curiosity might be contagious. The teacher's eye would narrow, the air would shift, and just like that your afternoon turned from recitation to interrogation. Most teachers didn't answer questions directly. They deflected, they scolded, they quoted scripture out of context, or they answered your question with a different question, like some kind of theological riddle designed to make you feel dumber than when you started. Master, what is the meaning of this word, and what is the meaning of your soul? Not helpful, Brother Thomas. But deeply unsettling, which was apparently the goal. Of course it didn't help that most teachers themselves weren't exactly fountains of knowledge. Many had memorized just enough to stay ahead of their students. Their authority wasn't built on expertise. It was built on fear routine and the general understanding that whoever held the rod got to define what correct meant. If a student caught a mistake, the teacher didn't admit it. He simply punished the student for noticing. Pride comes before a fall, he'd say, as the rod came down on your hand for daring to be right. It wasn't just the teachers. The other students hated your questions too. If you asked something and triggered a lecture that meant everyone got less time for food, for prayers, or on rare sacred occasions for silence, you became the reason Brother Anselm went on a 30-minute rant about moral decay. You became the reason Latin class ran long. You became the reason someone missed their turn at the fire pit. No one liked that kid. That kid often got mysteriously tripped on the way to the scriptorium. Some children learned to ask questions silently with raised eyebrows or with tentative gestures, but even those were risky. Facial expressions were suspicious. Curiosity was a slippery slope. Today you ask what a word means. Tomorrow you're doubting the virgin birth. It was better to stay quiet, to memorize, to chant, to become a human echo of every word written by someone holier, deader, and more unquestionable than you. If you really needed an answer, your best bet was to ask one of the few kids smarter than you quietly, privately, and with a mutual understanding that neither of you would report the other. It was like dealing in contraband, but instead of drugs, it was understanding. Whispered explanations, smuggled glossaries, a scribbled diagram in the dust behind the school. This was underground education, and it was the only reason some students ever learned anything at all. There was a particular cruelty to how students were punished for not knowing things they were never taught. You were expected to memorize but not comprehend, to recite but not interpret, to read aloud but never question what you read. The moment your mind stepped outside that narrow path, you were a problem, and problems were handled with bruises, shame, and silence. Some teachers genuinely believed they were doing God's work, that by shutting down curiosity they were protecting children from dangerous ideas. That free thought led to chaos, that the devil entered through open minds, so they sealed the door, not with logic, not with clarity, but with repetition, violence, and fear. The formula worked. Most children stopped asking questions. Some stopped thinking altogether, but not everyone conformed. Occasionally a student couldn't help themselves. They asked why things were the way they were, why God didn't speak in the language of the people, why the saints suffered so much, why they had to be beaten to learn. These weren't dumb questions, they were important ones. And every time one was asked, you could see the briefest flicker of panic in the teacher's eyes. Because deep down, even they didn't have the answers, and so the questions were buried. Not because they lacked value, but because they lacked permission. So next time a child asks why, take a moment. Because somewhere in a stone classroom centuries ago, another child asked the same thing and got a bruise instead of an answer. They weren't wrong. They were just early. In the modern world, when a student drops out of school, there are meetings concerned, phone calls, and at least 3 passive-aggressive letters from the principal. In medieval school, silence. No one asked why you stopped coming. No one checked in. You just vanished. One day you were there, hunched over your wax tablet, reciting Latin verbs with tears in your eyes, and the next day your spot was filled by another unfortunate soul with lice, and a last name no one bothered to learn. There was no attendance policy, no truancy officers, no child left behind. Children were left behind constantly, usually in the field, in the workshop, or quite literally in the mud. Education was a privilege, not a right, and if you couldn't keep up, or keep showing up, you didn't get a gentle exit. You just became another forgotten name in a parish ledger, your academic career ending with the same ceremony as a cough in the wind. Many kids never even made it through their first winter of schooling. Hunger, illness, accidents, or the simple fact that their parents decided they were more useful carrying firewood than conjugating amare. The priorities were simple: survival obedience and not angering the local lord. Reading didn't put bread on the table. Writing didn't stop wolves. So when push came to shove, and it always did, school lost. And it wasn't always voluntary. Some students were removed by their families after they'd developed inconvenient ideas like asking why their labour didn't belong to them, or why the priest got to eat meat on fasting days. A curious child was charming until they became annoying. Then they were reassigned to more productive pursuits, like dying in the fields at 40, or joining the army and dying sooner. Others simply couldn't afford the luxury of learning. Yes, even when tuition was free, there were hidden costs: ink, candles, shoes, time. Every moment in school was a moment not spent helping your family survive. Poor parents had to weigh every decision like it was life or death, because often it was, and if the child couldn't read yet, well, maybe next year. If there was a next year. Of course, some kids disappeared because they were too slow, or too sick, or too simple, as they said. There were no special education programs in the Middle Ages. If you couldn't memorize prayers, chant Latin, or stop asking what numbers were for, you were cast aside. Quietly, efficiently, sometimes cruelly. There were whispers about bad blood or God's punishment, and once those whispers started, no teacher wanted your soul on their ledger. Sometimes students disappeared on purpose. Escape was rare, but not impossible. A boy might run off in the middle of the night, trading the scriptorium for the unknown wilderness. A girl might slip away during prayer, choosing hunger and exile over a life of silence and forced piety. Those who left were spoken of in hushed tones, if at all. It was better for the school's image to pretend they never existed than to admit they chose freedom over fear. Punishment for leaving varied by who noticed. If your parents were powerful, your absence was a temporary illness. If they weren't, you became a cautionary tale. See what happens when you turn your back on learning, the teacher would say, holding up your empty wax tablet like a relic. The wolves took him. She became a beggar. They joined the heretics. Whether true or not didn't matter. Fear was more useful than facts. And then there were the students who should have left but couldn't. The ones too afraid to return home, too shamed to quit, too broken to speak. They sat in the back shadows of children slowly eroding under the weight of forced virtue. No one noticed them. No one helped them. They became part of the furniture, silent, slouched, sad. Teachers didn't grieve dropouts. If anything, they appreciated the extra room. Fewer mouths to correct, fewer eyes to monitor, fewer chances for error. A quiet classroom was a holy classroom, and every missing student brought that piece closer. The remaining kids learned the lesson well. Stay invisible, stay compliant, stay enrolled, if only to avoid becoming the next ghost no one talked about. There were no graduation ceremonies, no diplomas, no farewell letters or senior pranks. The end of your education came like the end of a candle, abrupt, smoky, and usually unnoticed. One day you were a student. The next you were hauling stones for a church that wouldn't let you inside, and nobody, not even the saints on the walls, blinked. In some cases, dropouts were taken in by monasteries not out of compassion, but out of utility. A half-educated child was still useful. You could sort scrolls, clean ink pots, run errands, keep silent. Sometimes that was the best-case scenario. More often they became novitiates not out of faith but out of necessity. Better to be a half-fed monk than a starved orphan. Girls had even fewer options. If they dropped out, they were married off, or cloistered, or in darker tales sold. Their education didn't matter because their future was already decided. And if they dared to show any ambition beyond domestic servitude, that ambition was swiftly crushed under the heel of doctrine and poverty. Their disappearance was total, not just from the school, but from the story. No one carved their names into desks. No one left notes in hidden books. No one remembered the faces that stopped showing up. And that was the most medieval thing of all, not the poverty, not the punishment, not the pain, but the silence. The way loss was treated as a normal part of the system. The way failure was expected and even designed. So next time someone boasts about how in the old days kids didn't drop out, remind them that they absolutely did. They just didn't come back. There were no second chances, no GEDs, no adult learning programs. You either endured until you broke or you broke and disappeared, and no one asked why. If you thought school today had too much homework, too many exams, or too little joy, allow me to introduce you to the medieval school curriculum, a program so bleak, so joyless, and so creatively painful, it could have been designed by a collaboration between a monk with anger issues and a saint with zero sense of humour. This wasn't just a syllabus. It was a medieval boot camp for the soul. There were no electives, no creative projects, no moments of spontaneous curiosity. Just one long, slow descent into structured suffering disguised as spiritual progress. The core subjects, Latin, more Latin, and if you behaved a little Latin, you didn't get to choose your subjects, you got to endure them. The goal wasn't to prepare you for life, the goal was to prepare you for a life of obedient silence and early death, preferably in a monastery. Every lesson was wrapped in scripture, tied with guilt, and handed to you by a teacher who hadn't smiled since Charlemagne was alive. Reading didn't mean diving into stories or learning about the world. It meant decoding dusty religious texts in a language you didn't understand, written by men who had long since rotted into sainthood. There was no fiction, no poetry that didn't involve a martyr bleeding for your sins, no tales of adventure unless they ended in chastity, fire, or both. Reading was a duty, not a delight. You read so you could repeat. You repeated so you could obey. Writing wasn't creative. It was mechanical. You copied and copied and copied again. Mistakes were punishable by humiliation beatings or hours spent redoing the same passage until your fingers cramped into claws. You learned calligraphy, but not composition. Penmanship, but not poetry. The only personal writing allowed was confession, and even then someone else usually read it. Math, if it existed at all, was basic. Just enough to calculate tithes, track livestock, or count candles. No geometry, no algebra, no understanding of why numbers worked, only that they did, and that the church had decided which ones were holy. The number 3 divine. The number 7 sacred. The number 13 don't ask. You didn't question math. You accepted it like doctrine vague, confusing and dangerous when challenged. Science. Don't make me laugh. Curiosity about the natural world was viewed with deep suspicion. Too many questions about stars, plants, or the human body, and suddenly you were accused of sorcery, or worse, rational thought. Disease was caused by sin, not bacteria. The sun rose because God liked it that way. And if your experiment didn't match church teaching, your experiment was wrong. End of lesson. History was taught through hagiographies, saint biographies filled with convenient miracles and very few dates. You didn't learn about the fall of empires or the rise of cities. You learned about Saint whoever resisting temptation while being boiled alive. That was your historical framework, one miracle per martyr, one lesson per limb lost. Forget timelines. Forget context. Remember suffering. Physical education. Only if you count kneeling for hours fetching buckets of water or walking barefoot to mass in the snow as PE credits. There were no sports, no games, no dancing. Those were indulgences of the flesh, and the flesh was suspicious at best, evil at worst. A student caught skipping rope might be made to fast for a week and recite the Psalms until their tongue went numb. Movement was fine as long as it was toward a candle, a Bible, or a teacher with a stick. Music was allowed if it was Gregorian chant sung in unison with zero expression. Harmony was frowned upon. Instruments were viewed with skepticism. Dancing was absolutely forbidden unless you were a saint hallucinating in a trance. Joyful noise was suspicious. The only acceptable sound was the low drone of boys trying not to weep while hitting the right Latin syllables on Kyrie eleison. Art only if it depicted Jesus the Virgin Mary or someone being martyred in a creatively horrifying way. Drawing anything else like an animal, a tree or a friend was a waste of ink and probably a sign of rebellion. Imagination was not encouraged. It was trimmed like weeds before it grew into something dangerous. A child who doodled in the margins was a child who would one day ask the wrong question. There were no field trips, no experiments, no projects. The closest you got to hands-on learning was when the teacher used his hands to correct your spelling with the back of a birch rod. School was not a place of growth. It was a place of pruning. You didn't learn to expand. You learned to shrink, to fold into yourself, quiet your thoughts, and fit neatly into the narrow mould carved out by people long dead. The worst part? Success didn't even look that different from failure. If you mastered the curriculum, you might be rewarded with more work, more expectations, and possibly a career as a low-level clerk who copied tax records until you died. No glory, no celebration. Just ink stains, eye strain, and the distant sound of another child crying through the wall. There were no grades, no progress reports. Just the teacher's opinion, which was often influenced by whether you had sneezed too loudly that morning or looked slightly too proud while reciting the credo. Feedback came in the form of slaps, muttered prayers, or the occasional nod of grim approval. You knew you were doing well if no one hit you. That was the benchmark. Despite all of this, parents still wanted their children in school, at least the boys. Because the curriculum, as soul-crushing as it was, came with one unspoken promise. If you survived it, if you kept your head down and your verbs straight, you might rise. Maybe to a monastery, maybe to a scriptorium. Maybe even to the priesthood where you could one day wield the same rod that once bruised your knuckles. The curriculum wasn't designed to enlighten, it was designed to discipline, to break the will and mould it into something obedient, unquestioning, and perpetually guilty. Learning wasn't liberation, it was submission. A slow, grinding process of becoming useful to the church, to the crown, or to whichever lord needed another educated servant. So next time you hear someone complain that schools today are too soft, invite them to recite Latin declensions on an empty stomach while kneeling on a cold floor with a rat watching. Ask them to copy the same sentence 200 times using a quill made from a suspicious goose. Challenge them to sing psalms with cracked lips and a bladder full of regrets, because in the medieval schoolroom the only thing more consistent than the suffering was the curriculum. The medieval schoolteacher was a paradox, simultaneously broke and feared underfed and over-respected, holy in theory, and horrifying in practice. He was not the warm cardigan-wearing figure modern minds might picture when they think educator. No, he was more executioner than mentor, more monk than man, and more rod than reason. His job was to mould young souls into obedient vessels of doctrine, and if a few backs got bent along the way, well, that was the price of divine discipline. Most teachers weren't chosen for their love of children or their pedagogical passion. They were monks, disgraced priests, scribes who'd run out of eyesight, or literate men just one crisis away from poverty. They were assigned the task because they could read chant and hit hard enough to enforce it. They were paid little, if at all, sometimes in food, sometimes in candles, occasionally an eternal reward, which is a fancy way of saying good luck with the afterlife because this life isn't getting better. Being a teacher was not a glamorous post. It was dirty, thankless, and often solitary. The classroom was cold. The students were sullen. The pay was pitiful. And the job security depended entirely on keeping children quiet, obedient and grammatically accurate in a dead language. If a student dared to challenge them, the teacher had to crush them quickly, loudly, and with a flair for theatrical punishment. To lose control was to lose the job. Or worse, to be accused of being too soft a fate, worse than plague among medieval schoolmasters. So they adapted. They built their reputations on fear, on silence, on the ability to swing a rod so hard the next 3 rows learned the lesson by osmosis. Many were bitter men twisted not only by theology, but by years of malnutrition, boredom, and professional irrelevance. Some took out their rage on the children. Others whispered their regrets to empty desks after class. A few taught with something resembling compassion, but only when no one was watching. Their methods were legendary. They could hit with precision insult, with creativity, and assign punishment that bordered on performance art. Kneeling on grains, holding books at arm's length until your shoulders screamed, writing the same line until your fingers bled, these were all part of the teaching toolkit. A successful lesson was one that ended in silence and visible fear. That was the medieval version of student engagement. Some teachers developed their own systems. Brother Petros, for example, had a rotating list of infractions matched to punishments written in Latin. Students learned to fear both the list and the language. Others employed humiliation, forcing students to wear donkey ears, repeat errors aloud, or recite confessions to the entire class. It wasn't about correction. It was about control. About dominance disguised as discipline and shame disguised as structure. Of course, many of these men were also deeply troubled. Years of isolation, poor food, and spiritual guilt had eroded their nerves. Some teetered on the edge of madness, muttering Latin declensions to themselves between lessons. Others were strict believers in a demons convinced that unruly students were possessed and required extraction via beating prayer or icy water poured down the shirt. And then there were the truly unhinged teachers who claimed to see visions, who held class outdoors in the snow to harden the spirit, who made students copy out sermons written during their dreams. And yet, despite all of this, they were respected. Not liked, not loved, but respected. Feared. Obeyed. They represented authority in a world where disobedience meant hellfire and literacy meant power. Parents trusted them. Villagers deferred to them. Even the local priest might consult them when interpreting scripture. Because the schoolmaster, despite his smell, his temper, and his questionable breakfast of cold onions, was the gatekeeper to knowledge, and thus to God. But knowledge came at a cost. These teachers were rarely trained in the art of teaching. They didn't study developmental psychology or engage in reflective practice. Their philosophy was simple. I learned this way, so now you will too. If it was hard for them, it should be hard for you. If it broke their spirit, well, maybe that's what made them holy. They passed down their pain like a relic. Still some tried. Some genuinely wanted their students to succeed, even if their definition of success meant becoming a copyist who wouldn't die of ink poisoning before age 30. These teachers offered scraps of kindness, an extra crust of bread, a moment of patience, a rare word of praise. And those scraps were remembered for years, sometimes forever. Because in a schoolroom full of cold eyes and hard hands, the slightest warmth felt like salvation. The students, meanwhile, developed a sixth sense for mood. They could detect a teacher's temper by the way he walked, the way he adjusted his robe, or how fast he opened the ink pot. They became experts at reading danger. They learned when to speak, when to shrink, and when to breathe as little as possible. They didn't learn through inspiration. They learned through instinct, through fear, through survival, and the burnout. It was real. Many teachers left the job half mad. Some drank. Some wandered off into the woods, convinced the squirrels were speaking in heretical tongues. A few ended up in monasteries, not for faith, but for peace. Teaching in the medieval world wasn't just a job. It was a slow unravelling of the mind, one misbehaving student at a time. So next time you complain about your history teacher giving pop quizzes or your professor grading too harshly, picture this: a hollow-eyed monk standing in a drafty room, surrounded by miserable children clinging to the only power he has. His ability to terrify a room full of lice-ridden boys into chanting Latin without blinking. His stomach is growling. His fingers are stained with ink and dried porridge. He hasn't slept in 3 days because he's also the church bell ringer, the accountant, and the rats won't leave his shoe alone. That man, he's your teacher, and you better get your grammar right. Or he'll teach you how to conjugate a scream you scream, we all scream medieval style. In today's schools, recess is a sacred window of joy, 10 or 15 minutes of glorious escape from the tyranny of math and grammar. But in medieval schools, recess wasn't a break. It was a change of scenery from punishment indoors to punishment outdoors. The playground wasn't a cheerful place with swings and slides. It was a patch of frozen mud, maybe a half-dead tree, and a suspicious pile of sticks that doubled as both a firewood stash and a discipline tool rack. You didn't run out screaming with joy. You shuffled out like a prisoner on laundry duty, praying the teacher's bad mood didn't follow you into the courtyard. There were no balls, no games, no designated play equipment. Play itself was viewed with caution, like an unnecessary luxury that made children soft sinful and likely to develop dangerous traits like imagination or laughter. If you were seen laughing too hard, someone might accuse you of pride. If you ran too fast, it was vanity. If you enjoyed yourself well, that was probably the devil warming up in your bloodstream. Best to stand quietly, perhaps push a stick around with your foot and try not to look like you were having a good time. The ground was usually hard, uneven and damp. In the summer it was dust and thorns. In the winter it was ice and regret. Shoes were optional, socks were mythological, and the sensation of toes was more memory than reality. Injuries were inevitable. A scraped knee meant exposed bone. A fall often ended in an improvised splint made from straw and silent panic, and no one rushed to help you. Assistance was not part of the curriculum. You picked yourself up, wiped the blood on your tunic, and returned to staring at the wall until the next round of chanting. Occasionally students tried to invent games, stick duels, dirt drawing. The Don't Blink or Brother Simon will make you recite the entire Book of Deuteronomy challenge. But these moments of play were fleeting, quickly extinguished by a passing teacher or a fellow student eager to report mischief. Tattling wasn't just common, it was currency. Being the one to break up a game earned you points, sometimes even a nod from the teacher. In medieval school, fun was contraband and snitching was practically a virtue. The outdoor time was also when punishments were doled out for the previous indoor sins. If you misspoke a prayer, your recess involved kneeling on frozen stones or holding buckets filled with water until your arms shook from effort and humiliation. Some were made to balance books on their heads, stand in corners, or clean chamber pots with brushes made from bristled guilt and shame. It wasn't recess. It was a continuation of class, just with more wind and visible suffering. The playground was often the same space where chickens pecked at mud and stray dogs wandered through barking at nothing and stealing what little food anyone had. There were rats in the corners, beetles underfoot. One poor boy once tried to build a little shelter out of twigs. He was accused of vanity and told to repent for his pride in architecture. Even creativity had consequences. Supervision came in two forms, overbearing and non-existent. Either a teacher stood watch like a storm cloud with sandals waiting for laughter so they could extinguish it, or no one watched at all because they were inside praying that the Lord would send fewer heretical children next semester. In the unsupervised moments, hierarchy took over. Older boys lorded over younger ones. Tiny tyrannies bloomed. Fistfights erupted quietly and ended with someone crying into their cloak while pretending it was just a really bad wind. Rain didn't cancel outdoor time, neither did snow, sleet, or the kind of wind that peels bark off trees. You went out because the teacher said so. If you caught a cold, that was your fault. If your fingers turned blue, it was a test of faith. And if you tried to hide indoors, you were branded a coward or worse, a thinker. Outdoor time wasn't for rest. It was for enduring a different flavour of misery. Girls, on the rare chance they were part of the school, often had a separate area, usually smaller, always sadder. They were expected to walk in circles, hands clasped, discussing scripture, or nothing at all. Smiling was discouraged. Frolicking was forbidden. A girl who skipped was either possessed or possessed ideas above her station. Outdoor time for them was less about movement and more about public demonstration of humility. Dirt beneath the feet, sun on the back, and a nun nearby with a glare sharp enough to slice bread. Sometimes visiting clergy would tour the school during these outdoor periods. Students were told to look busy but not cheerful, quiet but not dull. It was a performance, a living tableau of sanctified misery. Any hint of actual fun would be punished once the guests were gone. A boy who dared to smile at a priest was once made to carry a bucket of coal across the yard until his hands blistered. To burn the vanity from his palms, the teacher explained solemnly. The older students learned to endure it, to pace slowly, to stare at the wall, to pretend the cold didn't matter. But younger children, those poor small bundles of bones and hope, often cried. Not loudly, just small pitiful whimpers into sleeves that reeked of candle wax and forgotten porridge. They didn't yet know the rules of the outdoor playground. They still believed they might play laugh live a little. Silly things, dangerous things, and just when it seemed the wind might sweep everyone off into the dark arms of pneumonia, the teacher would call them back in. A small mercy. Except now their hands were too numb to hold a quill, their feet were wet and their noses dripped a medieval symphony of mucus and frostbite. But the lesson must go on. Whether or not you could feel your extremities was irrelevant. The Latin must be recited. The ink must be scratched. And if your fingers bled, well, consider it an offering. So next time you walk past a school playground and hear children laughing, running, shouting freely into the wind, remember that sound would have summoned a lecturer rod, or a quiet warning that the devil dances in the laughter of idle children. In the Middle Ages, recess wasn't a break from misery. It was just the same misery with slightly more sky. In medieval schools there was no pomp and circumstance, no caps tossed into the air, no proud families packed into creaky benches weeping at diplomas that took years to earn. No valedictorian speeches, no gold cords, no awkward group photos with one kid blinking. Graduation as we understand it today simply didn't exist, because frankly most students didn't finish anything except their will to live, and sometimes their eyesight. You didn't graduate from medieval school, you escaped it, slowly, painfully, and usually unnoticed. There was no final exam, no triumphant checklist of completed subjects, just a slow fade into adulthood when the schoolmaster stopped calling your name and started calling someone else's. If you stopped coming, it wasn't dropping out. It was moving on to farm work, war plague, or a life of copying tax records for a bishop who barely remembered your name. There was no diploma. The closest you got to proof of education was the ability to write your name, assuming you were important enough to have one, and maybe the skill to mumble a few Latin prayers without visibly trembling. No parchment, no ceremony, just the vague hope that you had absorbed enough misery to be considered formed. Your reward for years of spiritual flaying and ink-stained knuckles, the permission to leave. Some students were formally tested if you were part of a cathedral school or preparing for the priesthood, but even then it wasn't a graduation. It was more like a spiritual interrogation. You were quizzed not just on knowledge, but on faith behaviour and the volume of your recitation. You could answer every question correctly and still fail, because you looked too proud or too curious or not quite terrified enough. It wasn't about demonstrating competence. It was about proving you could survive and conform. For most boys, graduation came when someone else decided you were ready. Maybe the teacher sighed and said, "He's learned enough to be sent away." Or maybe the student simply stopped coming his time now required in the fields, in his father's shop or on the battlefield. There was no party, no goodbyes. One day you were there and the next your spot was taken by another child with chapped lips and an aching spine. The highest achievement being noticed. If your teacher recommended you to a monastery or a bishop or a wealthy patron, you had made it. But made it often meant a life of transcription celibacy and very little food. Your celebration was a longer robe and less sunlight, and still you were the lucky one. Everyone else just faded into obscurity, their names recorded in the dust of the floorboards, if at all. For girls, graduation meant one thing, marriage usually arranged, always expected. If you could read, write, or recite a psalm by heart, that was a bonus, not for you, but for your husband. Your education ended the moment someone decided your womb had more value than your mind. You were taken out of the classroom and placed into the kitchen, the nursery, or the nunnery. Your lessons continued, but they were no longer about grammar or logic. They were about obedience, modesty, and how to suffer silently. Some ended up in monasteries or convents, not because they graduated, but because they had nowhere else to go. In those sacred walls they continued their education, yes, but also their isolation, their fasting, and their slow erosion into holy anonymity. The best you could hope for was to be remembered in death. Maybe someone would copy your name into a manuscript margin. Maybe someone would pray for your soul once a year. That was the medieval version of alumni benefits. There was no final moment to say I made it. No walk across a stage, no handshake, no uncomfortable photo with a teacher who never liked you anyway. Your rite of passage was invisible. You knew you were done when your hands were too cramped to hold a quill, or when someone looked at you and saw a worker instead of a child. Your celebration was the absence of more suffering, and even that was temporary. In rare cases, schools held small recognition events, usually religious in tone, always dull. Maybe a prayer was said, maybe a candle was lit, maybe the student got to read aloud without getting hit. There were no speeches, just murmurs, and maybe a piece of dried bread as a treat. Your reward wasn't applause, it was survival, and the ones who really excelled, the geniuses, the prodigies, they were shipped off, not with fanfare but with fear, because intelligence was dangerous. A smart child was a liability unless controlled, so they were cloistered, disciplined, and handed over to the church before they could start asking the wrong questions, the ones that couldn't be answered with scripture and a beating. For those who remained in town, their knowledge slowly faded. Latin turned to rust. Quill skills dulled. The prayers became background noise. They remembered the pain more than the content. Years later, someone might ask, "Did you go to school?" and they'd nod, but it wouldn't be pride on their face, it would be something closer to exhaustion. A memory not of achievement, but of endurance. There were no reunions, no letters, no class photos. Your classmates dispersed into the fog of adult life, where death, disease, and taxes waited with outstretched arms. If you met one of them again, it wasn't with joy. It was with the awkward recognition of shared trauma. A glance, a nod, a quiet "you too," and then back to work. Even the church, with its obsession over ceremony, didn't see school as something to celebrate. It was a means to an end. You were trained to serve, not to shine, to replicate, not to innovate, to endure, not to enjoy. The fact that you knew something wasn't the point. The point was that you knew your place. So next time you attend a graduation with balloons and music and proud tears, remember that there was a time when none of that existed. When education ended not with triumph, but with silence. When graduation meant you're useful, now go away. And when the only thing marking the transition was your own confusion at why no one hit you that day. In medieval schools, you didn't graduate. You simply stopped being beaten. If you think bullying is a modern problem, let me take you back to the medieval classroom, a place where bullying wasn't a behavioural issue to be corrected. It was part of the system, part of the education. If the weak didn't suffer, how else would they learn humility? Medieval schools didn't just tolerate bullying, they endorsed it, structured it, and in some cases weaponized it. It was hierarchy in action, piety through pain and socialization via humiliation. The pecking order was clear from the moment you stepped into the classroom. The older students sat closer to the teacher. They were the unofficial enforcers wielding a mix of seniority muscle and petty cruelty. The youngest children, they sat near the draughty door, surrounded by the chill of the outdoors and the icy disdain of their elders. There was no buddy system, no mentoring program, no safe space. There was only the constant hope that today's tormentor might be too tired to notice you. Teachers didn't stop the bullying. Often they started it. They humiliated the weaker students in front of the class, mocked their stutters, ridiculed their errors, and turned their mistakes into performance art. Look at little Thomas, a teacher might say. He cannot remember a single line. Perhaps his brain leaked out his ears. Laughter followed. Not because it was funny, but because not laughing made you the next target. It was survival by conformity with shame as the background music. Older students were given privileges, most dangerously the right to assist in discipline. That meant they could hit, scold, or shame younger students under the guise of helping. It wasn't discipline, It was legalized bullying. A boy 2 years older than you might walk by and smack your head for improper posture. If you objected, you were disrespecting authority. If you cried, you were told to grow up. If you hit back, straight to penance or worse. This wasn't just tolerated. It was seen as a vital part of character formation. Suffering built virtue. Weakness invited correction. And cruelty was simply part of growing up like hunger lice and watching your classmates faint during mass. You weren't supposed to complain. You were supposed to become stronger or disappear. Those were the only options. The school didn't ask if you were okay. It asked if you were useful. The playground, such as it was, turned into a gladiator pit of psychological warfare. Taunts about clothing, family hygiene, or lack thereof were common. If your father was poor, if your mother had a bad reputation, if you mispronounced Latin, it all became ammunition. Boys ganged up on one another. Girls, when present, were judged mercilessly on silent obedience and whether they dared to look anyone in the eye. And the teachers. They used this division to keep control. If a class was getting restless, all the teacher had to do was single out a student with trembling hands or a smudged tunic. "Why can't you all be more like Geoffrey?" he'd say, gesturing to the teacher's pet, the one who had memorized all the psalms and none of the empathy. Geoffrey would smirk. You would shrink. And just like that, the class was united again against you. Mockery wasn't random. It was a teaching tool. Some teachers developed nicknames for students based on their worst traits. Stumble-tongue, goose-eyes, little heretic. These names stuck. They followed you home. They followed you through life. A boy once called Donkey Ears never lived it down. He became Donkey at market in the tavern, and finally on his gravestone here lies Donkey, son of Matthew. A lesson in permanence delivered with a grin. Then there was the public punishment, the performative aspect of pain. Students were often beaten in front of their peers, not behind closed doors, not quietly, loudly, visibly, with a lecture, with a moral, with a message. This is what happens when you stray. It created fear, and fear created obedience. And obedience in the eyes of the school was the only thing that mattered. Some students internalized it. They became bullies themselves, not out of cruelty, but because it was the only model of power they'd ever seen. If you couldn't be respected, you could be feared. If you couldn't rise, you could push someone else down. A few became truly sadistic little inquisitors in training, perfecting their scorn and sarcasm. Others suffered in silence, their confidence dissolving under years of ridicule until they spoke in whispers and flinched at kindness. The church's message was clear: suffering refines the soul. And schools took that message literally. A bruised child was a holy child. A silent child was a disciplined child. And a crying child, well, that meant the rod was working. Redemption through ridicule. Salvation through suffering. Even laughter was dangerous unless you were laughing at someone. Laughing with someone that was suspicious. Laughter, like curiosity, had to be controlled. If parents ever found out, most didn't intervene. In many cases, they approved. "That's how you toughen them up," they'd say. "That's how I learned." Pain was generational. It passed from teacher to student to family and back again. A cycle of misery wrapped in scripture and tied with a leather strap. And yet some students survived it. A few even resisted. They formed secret friendships past jokes when no one was looking, whispered encouragement in the dark corners of the yard. These bonds were small rebellions, dangerous, beautiful. Two students sitting close enough to share warmth, trading Latin insults behind the teacher's back. It didn't fix anything, but it helped someone get through another day. So next time someone says bullying builds character, remind them that in medieval schools it built fear, it built silence, it built trauma, and it built a classroom full of children who learned to flinch before they learned to write. Because in that world, kindness wasn't part of the lesson plan, and the bruises didn't fade. Every medieval school had one. That one kid, the one who didn't flinch when the rod came down, The one who could chant Latin before breakfast, hand-raised spine, straight eyes shining not with fear but with joy. While the rest of the class stared at the floor, praying not to be noticed, this kid was asking for more verses, more grammar drills, more psalms to copy by moonlight. You know the type. In modern schools, they're called teachers' pets. In medieval schools, they were called future monks. No one trusted him, of course. The other students avoided him like a plague-bearing rat. Not because he was mean, he wasn't. He was worse. He was earnest. He didn't just memorize the rules, he believed in them. While the rest of the class muttered prayers through chattering teeth, this boy sang them. Loudly, in perfect pitch, with harmony, his voice rising like incense into the freezing rafters, while everyone else fantasized about bread and escape. He never got beaten. Not because he didn't make mistakes, he did, but he apologized for them before the teacher had time to raise the rod. Forgive me, brother. I miswrote the ablative absolute. I shall rewrite the entire scroll in penance. And then he'd do it. Twice. With better calligraphy. While fasting. For fun. His penmanship was immaculate. His robes were always tidier than yours. And he somehow managed to look clean, even when everyone else smelled like goat and fear. The teachers adored him. He was proof that their methods worked. Proof that a child could be shaped into something obedient, pious, and ideally silent unless reciting scripture. Why can't you all be more like Hugo, they'd say, while Brother Hugo smiled serenely, clutching his wax tablet like it was a sacred relic. You wanted to hate him. But it was hard to hate someone so peaceful, so unaware, so genuinely thrilled to be in a place where the rest of you were slowly dying inside. His favourite subject, Latin of course, followed closely by illuminated manuscripts, martyrdom stories and voluntary fasting. He once wrote an essay unassigned naturally about the virtues of sleeping on the floor to strengthen the soul. He submitted it to the teacher, not for praise, but because he thought it might inspire others. It didn't. But it did get pinned to the wall as an example, where it stared at you, for weeks. Whispering Hugo didn't need hay in his mattress. Why do you... No one knew where he came from. Some said his mother had a vision during childbirth. Others claimed he never cried, as a baby just stared at the ceiling mouthing scripture. It was rumoured he had no siblings, because one had looked at him wrong and turned to salt. He never confirmed this. He just shrugged and said, "The Lord works in mysterious ways," which somehow made it creepier. Hugo didn't just obey the rules, he anticipated them. He bowed before being told. He confessed sins he hadn't committed just to stay ahead. He corrected the teacher once and was praised for it. No one else could have gotten away with that. If you'd tried, you'd have been slapped with a salter. But Hugo could walk on water if the teacher said it was part of the curriculum. Eventually it became clear that Hugo wasn't going anywhere. Not to the fields, not to the marketplace, not to a marriage arranged by sweaty relatives who saw women as livestock. He was destined for the cloister, the scriptorium, the quiet, candle-lit life of someone who truly deeply wanted to spend his days copying the book of Leviticus by hand without abbreviation. And so the school prepared him, with extra lessons, with private prayers, with Latin texts so dense they made the Bible look like a bedtime story. The day he left for the monastery, no one cried. Except maybe the teacher, but it's hard to tell when monks cry. The rest of the students exchanged looks, equal parts relief and dread. Relief that Hugo was gone. Dread that the teachers would now choose another favourite. You waited to see who it would be. Spoiler, it wasn't you. It never is. Because no one else liked the pain. Meanwhile, Hugo adjusted to monastic life like a fish to holy water. He took to the silence, the fasting, the vows of obedience, like he'd been practicing since birth, which, let's face it, he probably had. He rose before dawn to pray. He copied texts until his fingers bled and then thanked God for the privilege. He even volunteered to clean the privy. Twice. No one asked him to. He just wanted to be of service. His letters, because of course he wrote letters, were filled with joy. The silence here is deeper than the silence at school. I can hear God between every heartbeat. You meanwhile were trying to hear anything other than your stomach growling during grammar recitations. Hugo wrote about how beautiful the scriptorium was. You remembered it as a place where you nearly passed out from ink fumes and boredom. But Hugo saw heaven in a line of Latin text. You saw a headache. Years later, people would remember him. That boy was destined for holiness, they'd say, conveniently forgetting that he once corrected a priest's sermon mid-service. So humble, so gifted. The rest of you would be forgotten. Ploughboys, bakers, bandits, maybe one poor soul who died after confusing a saint's relic with a goat bone. But Hugo, he'd be remembered, revered, possibly canonized. Was he strange? Absolutely. But in a system that rewarded compliance, piety, and voluntary suffering, Hugo wasn't the outlier. He was the ideal. The product of everything the school hoped to produce a quiet, obedient mind in a thin, disciplined body. A boy who didn't need a rod because he carried one himself, metaphorically ready to beat his own thoughts into submission at the first sign of joy. So next time you see someone thriving in a system designed to crush the spirit, don't be too quick to envy them. Remember Hugo, the boy who loved grammar drills, the child who saw beauty in punishment, the student who didn't just survive medieval school, he enjoyed it. And he's probably praying for you right now, in Latin. Let's take a moment, a deep breath. Now ask yourself, do you still want to go back? Still dream of simpler times? Still picture monks humming in candlelit peace and children laughing in cobblestone courtyards as Gregorian chants echo in the distance? Because if that's the fantasy you're clinging to, congratulations. You've been thoroughly catfished by history. The truth is, medieval school wasn't Hogwarts. It was closer to Hunger Games meets The Exorcist, but with more Latin and less mercy. You didn't graduate, you survived. If you were lucky. If your parents weren't dead, the lice hadn't chewed your scalp bald, and you hadn't accidentally sneezed during a lesson punishable offence, disturbing the sacred silence, then maybe you made it to the age of 14 with a working spine and enough ink-stained fingers to write your own sad memoir. Still think those stone buildings were charming. That musty scent of parchment and incense was actually centuries of sweat, mildew, and adolescent tears. Medieval schools didn't smell like knowledge. They smelled like a goat had taken a vow of celibacy and died of regret in the corner. And those noble teachers with long robes and longer sermons, half of them were one unpaid salary away from snapping and tossing a student out the window for mispronouncing ecclesia. There were no school bells. Just church bells, and they didn't signal recess, they screamed repent. You didn't get detention for skipping homework, you got whipped for not memorizing the Beatitudes. And if you asked why, that counted as blasphemy and disrespect. Double sin, double the beat down. Teachers didn't explain, they glared, and if they smiled, you ran. Because that smile meant someone was about to cry, probably you. And don't even think about daydreaming. In today's world, you'd get diagnosed with ADHD and offered accommodations. In medieval school, you got publicly shamed and a new nickname like Lazy Lucian that followed you to the grave or the monastery. The curriculum was less about creativity and more about repetition until your brain went numb and your hand curled permanently into a quill-gripping claw. Romanticised history likes to sell you the idea that learning back then was spiritual, sacred, noble. What they don't mention is that it was also about as fun as licking a hot anvil. You want to know what passed for playtime copying more psalms, or standing still with your hands on your head because you coughed during Vespers. If you smiled, you were suspect. If you laughed, you were possessed. There was no counselling, no therapy, no safe spaces. If you were overwhelmed, you confessed your weakness and prayed for God to smite the doubt out of you. Maybe literally. Some students even thanked their teachers for the beatings. He's moulding my soul, they'd say. Sure. just like a blacksmith moulds metal with fire force and a hammer to the face. And don't forget the real kicker, you probably couldn't even understand half the words. Because Latin, everything was in Latin, mass Latin, lessons Latin, insults Latin. If you dared speak in your native tongue, you were accused of being uncultured, unholy, or worse, French. Nothing personal, just scholastic nationalism. Yet here we are, centuries later, sipping oat milk lattes, swiping through dating apps, and reminiscing about the beauty of medieval life. You know, back when your average breakfast was stale porridge, and your average classroom had more fleas than books. Nostalgia's funny like that. It edits out the plague and leaves you the stained glass windows. So the next time you hear someone say I was born in the wrong century, take their phone, throw it in a medieval cesspit, hand them a wooden writing slate and lock them in a freezing church for 6 hours. See how long their romanticism lasts. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe until the lice bite. Maybe until the teacher recites the 10 Commandments and then breaks 3 of them in how he disciplines you. Let's be honest, we wouldn't last an hour. Not with our indoor plumbing, our snacks, our emotional support water bottles. We cry when the Wi-Fi drops for 6 seconds. Medieval students didn't even have chairs, and when they got sick, no nurse's office, just a priest with oil and maybe a shovel. So here's your final lesson. Yes, the Middle Ages gave us cathedrals, manuscripts, and some questionable saints. But it also gave us underfed students, unhinged teachers, and enough corporal punishment to make a modern lawsuit tremble. Romanticise all you want, just don't forget the splinters, the screams, and the saint-approved suffering. Because history isn't a fairy tale. It's a footnote written in blood, sweat, and badly conjugated Latin.